In the 1920s, America had dazzled itself into a shimmering illusion of endless prosperity. Radios crackled with jazz, automobiles multiplied across dusty roads, and advertisements promised luxury within arm's reach. The average person might have believed that hunger, real, bone-deep hunger, was something that happened in other countries, in faraway lands where people lived in mud huts and begged for rice. Not here. Not in the United States, the land of plenty. The land where grocery shelves gleamed with canned goods, and soda fountains never stopped pouring. But in October of 1929, the illusion shattered. The stock market crash wasn't just a moment, it was a long, slow avalanche. Jobs vanished. Bank accounts evaporated overnight. Families who once considered steak a modest Wednesday meal suddenly couldn't afford bread crusts. In cities, rural towns, farms, and suburbs alike, the same invisible beast crept quietly into homes, gnawed at pantries, and settled into stomachs. Hunger. Not the kind that makes you cranky at 3 p.m., but the kind that leaves your limbs weak, your vision swimming, your thoughts obsessively circling the next possible scrap. The Great Depression didn't just wreck economies. It devoured dinner tables. For a generation of Americans, food became something not to enjoy, but to chase, stretch, and sacrifice for. By 1932, estimates suggest that at least 1 in 4 Americans was unemployed. No income meant no groceries. Many families sold their possessions for sacks of flour. Others lined up for miles just to get a bowl of soup, diluted so many times that it was little more than warm water with hope stirred in. This wasn't limited to the homeless or the poorest of the poor. Even middle-class families found themselves teetering. People who had once employed servants now took in laundry. Children who used to bring sandwiches to school now carried nothing at all, or a slice of bread wrapped in wax paper, stretched to look like more than it was. Hunger was a great equalizer, stripping away class, background, and pride. Everyone had to adapt. And so began one of the most desperate periods of culinary invention in American history. People did not stop eating. But what they ate changed. Dramatically. Meals were no longer about flavor or nutrition. They were about sustenance, disguise, and illusion. Could you turn a handful of flour, a splash of water, and a spoonful of lard into dinner for 6? Many people had to. And they did. Flour became a lifeline. A sack of it could last a month if you rationed it well enough. People made dumplings with no filling. Breads with no yeast. Pancakes with no milk. They fried dough scraps into greasy treats, and pretended it was dessert. Sugar was rare. Butter even rarer. Lard was used not just to cook, but to smear on bread in place of anything tastier. Some called it poor man's butter. It didn't taste good. But it kept you full. In city tenements, smells of boiling cabbage wafted out of cracked windows. Families cooked whatever could be found. Potato skins became broth. Stale bread was soaked in water and pan-fried. Some children grew up thinking onions boiled in water was just how soup was supposed to taste. In rural areas, people turned to the land, not because they wanted to live off the grid, but because it was the only grid they had. Dandelions weren't weeds anymore. They were salad greens. Squirrels weren't vermin. They were meat. Foraging became part of daily life. Families learned which berries were edible, which roots could be boiled, and how to cook wild greens without poisoning themselves. There were stories, some true, some exaggerated, of people boiling boots for soup. Of cooking newspaper when flour ran out. Of eating lard on lettuce. And while not all these tales were literal, they reflected a grim truth: food had become something to improvise, to imagine. The idea of a roast chicken, or a slice of pie, became a dream people shared in silence. Meals were often eaten in near silence too. There was shame in being hungry. And even more shame in not being able to feed your family. Children born during the Depression would grow up to hoard food, hide candy, and finish every last crumb on their plates, even decades later. They had learned young that food could disappear. And that hunger wasn't something you told people about. It lived quietly inside your stomach, just beneath your ribs. A dull ache you simply got used to. As soup kitchens rose across the country, feeding thousands a day, so too did a national conversation about responsibility and shame. Some said those who were hungry had only themselves to blame. Others argued that no one should starve in a country overflowing with wheat and corn and cows. But crops don't feed people by themselves. You needed money or government support. And for a long time, both were in short supply. Despite the despair, the story of food in the Great Depression is not just one of suffering. It's a story of ingenuity, of people taking what little they had and making it stretch. Recipes were passed from neighbor to neighbor. Tips were shared: how to fake a pie crust, how to make lard taste like butter, how to boil cabbage so the smell wouldn't make the kids gag. It was also a time when women, often the home cooks, became quiet heroes. They made meals from almost nothing. They kept the family fed. They smiled through the disappointment of serving thin soup and stale bread, and called it special dinner night. Because pretending it was a celebration made the children feel better. And maybe, for a minute, made the ache fade. Food was central to survival in a very real way. But it also held families together emotionally. Meals were the one moment everyone gathered. Even if there wasn't much on the plate, there was something shared. A bowl passed hand to hand. A prayer spoken over mashed crackers. A mother pretending that hot water and a boo-willen cube was beef stew. This story, then, isn't just about strange recipes or gross substitutions. It's about people enduring, day after day, one forkful at a time. Food was life, but it was also storytelling, memory, and survival. As we begin this journey into what people actually ate during the Great Depression, prepare to be both amused and heartbroken. You'll meet meals made of cardboard and hope, dishes that defied logic, and recipes that required no ingredients but stubbornness. And you'll understand why, for many, a bowl of plain beans could taste like a feast. It's boring history, yes? But in the quiet details of an empty plate, there's more story than most wars and revolutions combined. In the years before the Great Depression, the American dinner table was a modest, comforting centerpiece of daily life. While not everyone dined in grandeur, most families had come to expect certain familiar rhythms: meat a few times a week, eggs and bacon for breakfast, vegetables from the garden or grocer, bread fresh from the oven or bakery. There was order in it. There was pride. It wasn't fancy for most, but it was dependable. You sat at the table. You ate what you could afford. And you didn't worry about where tomorrow's meal might come from. The crash of 1929 changed that. Not overnight, but steadily, unrelentingly, the ingredients that once filled kitchen shelves and pantries began to disappear. At first, families cut back on luxuries. No more roasts for Sunday dinner. No fresh oranges. No real butter. Cakes became smaller, baked less often, or left unfrosted. Then came the substitutions. Powdered milk instead of fresh. Stale bread repurposed again and again. Leftover meat stretched into stews, then gravy, then broth. Soon, there were no leftovers at all. Because there were no meals substantial enough to produce them. Meat, once a dependable component of a family's diet, all but vanished for the poor and even the working class. Eggs became precious, sometimes purchased, one or two at a time. Milk was watered down. Vegetables came from cans if they came at all. Fresh produce was a luxury. The dinner table, once a place of connection, gradually became a site of quiet tension. Parents worried silently as they set out meals that would never be enough. Children learned not to ask for seconds. The meal became a performance, not of enjoyment, but of stoicism. Of pretending that what was on the plate was just what everyone wanted. Even if it was little more than boiled cabbage and a few spoonfuls of beans. For many families, mealtime had always followed a kind of script. Dinner at 6. A roast, maybe a stew. A loaf of bread or biscuits. A simple dessert, perhaps a slice of pie or custard. Parents served, children waited. There was formality in it, a structure that reflected not just nourishment, but identity. That too fell away. People began eating whenever they were hungry and when the food was available. Formal meals became informal scrambles. A slice of bread mid-morning, a bit of broth at night. If you found something, you ate it. The very meaning of a meal changed. What counted as lunch might have once been tossed to the birds. A meal could now be a single biscuit and a glass of water, a chunk of onion with salt, a few spoonfuls of rice, unseasoned, unadorned. In rural areas, entire dinners consisted of boiled cornmeal mush or fried slices of potato. In cities, people leaned on food sold for pennies, street pretzels, hot chestnuts, or stewed tomatoes sold from carts. Even that was a stretch for many. The Depression's impact was not just physical. It was emotional. Food, or the lack of it, became a silent measurement of failure, frustration, and fear. Fathers who had once brought home hearty dinners now stared at empty plates with shame. Mothers who had taken pride in pies and preserves were now boiling cabbage 3 nights in a row and calling it stew. Children sensed the tension, even if they didn't understand the economics. A generation learned early how to pretend to be full, how to smile with an empty stomach, how to chew slowly to make a cracker last. There's something profoundly human about sitting around a table to eat. It's an act of ritual, of unity. During the Great Depression, that act persisted, but in muted form. The table was still there, but the bounty was not. Families gathered anyway, sometimes just for moral support. Even if the meal was only tea and toast. In multifamily homes and shared tenements, dinner sometimes became a communal affair. People pooled what little they had, half a bag of beans, a few potatoes, a handful of rice, and made a stew in a shared pot. These impromptu feasts were thin, flavorless, but deeply symbolic. They said, "We're in this together." And that mattered. Because hunger isolates. But shared hunger can unite. Some families coped with humor. They gave their sad meals grand names. A single slice of bread, with grease was toast royale. Soup made from a bouillon cube, and leftover rice was chef special. An empty plate was air pie. A sandwich with no filling. Oh, wish sandwich. Because you wished something was inside. Others turned to recipes that required almost no ingredients. Depression-era cookbooks and newspaper clippings featured foods like vinegar pie, mock apple pie made from crackers, and baked flour in water crusts with a sprinkle of cinnamon. People used flavor substitutes to create a sense of variety. Vanilla was swapped for vinegar, molasses for sugar. Even animal feed was sometimes repurposed. Corn meant for livestock was ground, sifted, and turned into coarse bread. As the Depression dragged on, entire meal customs faded. Breakfast, once the pride of American family life, became a skipped ritual for many. Lunch might be nothing but a cup of hot water. Dinner was the only real chance at calories, and often, it wasn't much. Meal times blurred. People ate when they could, what they could, where they could. Even holidays lost their flavor. Thanksgiving tables featured no turkey, just bread stuffing. Christmas dinners were more about family than food, because there wasn't enough to go around. Cakes were made without butter, milk, or eggs, depression cakes, as they came to be called. Baked in tin cans. Sweetened with boiled raisins, if they were available. In photographs from the era, the tables look bare. Plates are chipped. Cups are mismatched. The food is minimal, a scoop of something pale, a wedge of dry bread, a ladle of bean broth. But the faces around those tables, tired, hollowed out, yet composed, say more than menus ever could. These were people surviving day by day, bite by bite. The fall of the American dinner table wasn't just about food. It was about the loss of structure, of rhythm, of comfort. Mealtime was once a daily promise, that no matter what happened in the world, you could sit down and eat. The Depression broke that promise. And in its place came uncertainty, improvisation, and the quiet acceptance that sometimes there just wasn't going to be enough. And yet, people endured. They adjusted. They told stories. They made jokes. They sang songs at the table to distract the children from the emptiness of their bowls. And in those moments, the American dinner table transformed. It wasn't about what was on the plate anymore. It was about being together. About surviving another day. In the harshest years of the Great Depression, when jobs were gone and pantries were bare, a strange sight began to appear on street corners, in church basements, and outside shuttered businesses. Long lines of people, men in worn coats, women clutching children, the elderly leaning on makeshift canes, all waiting silently, patiently, for a bowl of soup and a slice of bread. These were soup kitchens. Quiet sanctuaries in a starving world. The term, soup kitchen, might conjure up images of warmth and generosity, but the reality was far more grim. These were not cozy, cheerful places. They were often drafty, overcrowded, and overwhelmed by demand. Yet for millions of Americans, they were the only thing standing between hunger and collapse. They weren't designed for comfort. They were designed for calories. And even those were in short supply. At first, soup kitchens were a grassroots effort. Churches, community groups, and a few generous business owners began offering free meals. The need was immediate and enormous. In cities like Chicago, New York, and Detroit, entire city blocks became queues of the hungry. A soup kitchen might feed 1,000 people a day. Then 2,000. Then 10. Some of the earliest and most famous soup kitchens were funded by unlikely benefactors. Al Capone, the infamous gangster, opened a soup kitchen in Chicago in 1930, feeding over 1,000 people daily. His motives were questionable, but his impact was immediate. For those in line, it didn't matter where the soup came from, only that it was hot in there. What did the soup actually taste like? That depended. It was usually a watery broth, bulked out with barley, split peas, lentils, or macaroni. Vegetables were rare and often donated seconds, bruised carrots, cabbage trimmings, wilted onions. Meat was nearly mythical. If it appeared at all, it was as a faint flavor, left behind by a bone boiled for hours, then removed. Still, people returned daily for that thin, warm lifeline. The slice of bread that accompanied the soup was usually just as humble. Often stale, sometimes dry enough to crumble in the hand, it was still food. It could be dipped in the broth to soften it, or saved for later. Many people rationed it carefully, taking a bite now, hiding the rest in a pocket for the next meal, or for a hungry child waiting back home. These kitchens weren't places for socializing. The atmosphere was heavy. People spoke in murmurs, if at all. Eyes stayed low. Pride was fragile, and shame was thick in the air. For many, lining up for free food felt like a failure, even if they had worked hard their whole lives. Even if they had no choice. Hunger eroded dignity. But hunger was stronger than pride. The logistics of feeding thousands on limited resources were complex. Volunteers peeled vegetables for hours. Donations arrived sporadically. Some kitchens ran out of food by noon. Others watered the soup further to stretch it. There were no menus. No choices. Just whatever could be scraped together. One day might be turnip soup. The next day, nothing but broth made from potato skins and hot water. Yet even in this desperation, there was order. People queued patiently. Volunteers served methodically. A bowl. A ladle. A slice of bread. Move along. The line never stopped. From dawn to dusk. There was no time for conversation. Only mouths to feed. Children were often given priority. A thin boy with shoes too big might get 2 ladles of soup instead of 1. Mothers with infants were sometimes handed a small jug of milk, if it was available. These gestures were small, but deeply meaningful. In a world where survival was uncertain, a second helping was an act of grace. The expansion of soup kitchens wasn't just a charitable response. It became a political issue. As the federal government slowly awoke to the depth of the crisis, programs were introduced to support public relief efforts. Under Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, programs like the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA, began supplying local charities with ingredients. Still, it was never enough. Demand always exceeded supply. Some cities developed mobile soup kitchens, trucks loaded with giant pots, parked in different neighborhoods each day. People learned the schedule like clockwork. The truck comes to 3rd and Vine on Tuesdays. They have stew near the school on Fridays. Word of mouth was everything. Miss a day, and you might not eat at all. There were rules too. Some kitchens required people to prove they had no income. Others handed out tickets in advance. Many simply turned people away once the food was gone. Fights were rare, but desperation sometimes boiled over. A man denied a meal might weep. A mother might beg for her child. Volunteers, many of whom were barely better off themselves, had to make impossible decisions. Despite the hardship, many soup kitchens became deeply rooted in their communities. Churches opened their doors not just to the hungry, but to the hopeless. They offered warmth, kind words, and sometimes a hymn or a prayer before the meal. A moment of human dignity, shared over cracked bowls and chipped mugs. In smaller towns, soup kitchens often operated out of schoolhouses or town halls. The community gathered to donate what they could: a sack of potatoes, a few onions, a bushel of corn. The soup pot became a communal symbol. A place where people contributed, no matter how little. And in return, they all shared in the meal. There were many variations of the soup itself. Some kitchens served what was called Hoover stew, a concoction of boiled macaroni, canned tomatoes, and whatever vegetables were on hand. Sometimes beans. Sometimes nothing more than cabbage leaves. The name, a sarcastic jab at President Hoover, was born from bitterness. But the stew itself became iconic, a stand-in for everything wrong, and everything resilient. For many children, their first experience with organized charity came through these kitchens. They learned to wait quietly, to hold their tin cup carefully, to say thank you to the tired woman handing them soup. Some even brought old jars or tin cans from home to take extra for siblings who couldn't leave the house. Over time, these kitchens left a permanent mark on memory. Survivors of the Depression would speak of them decades later, often with mixed feelings: gratitude for the food, sorrow for the need. The smell of thin vegetable broth, the taste of week-old bread, became etched into the sensory archive of an entire generation. Some could never eat lentil soup again without flinching. Others cherished it as a reminder of what they survived. The legacy of soup kitchens continues to this day. Modern food pantries and free meal programs trace their roots directly to these humble Depression-era beginnings. The idea that no one should go hungry, even when systems fail, is a lesson burned into history. But back then, it was simple. A pot, a line, a spoon, a quiet meal of hot liquid and hope. In a time when the world seemed to fall apart, soup kitchens stitched together a fragile thread of survival. One bowl at a time. When you have a refrigerator stocked with vegetables, meats, sauces, and maybe even a frozen pizza or two, cooking is about taste. It's about variety, experimentation, convenience. But in the homes of the Great Depression, cooking was an act of survival, a deliberate, measured ritual of stretching the impossible. Food wasn't just prepared. It was eked out, conjured from whatever remained, or what could be traded, or what was quietly growing in the yard. The typical pantry in a Depression-era home did not look like today's pantry. It often consisted of flour, salt, maybe some cornmeal or oats, and lard, if the family was lucky. Milk might come in powdered form, or not at all. Sugar was rare, and honey even rarer. Vegetables came from the backyard or the neighbor's generosity. Fruit was a luxury, often only eaten in season, or canned and preserved long before. Faced with these limitations, home cooks, almost always women, became innovators of necessity. Their mission was simple: take almost nothing and turn it into dinner. They did not cook with cookbooks. They cooked from memory, from improvisation, from scraps. Each meal was a problem to solve. Each solution fed a family, just barely. Consider bread. A staple in most homes. But yeast was not always available. So people made quick breads, baked goods, leavened with baking soda or baking powder, when they had it. Others skipped leavening entirely and made dense, flat biscuits that could be eaten fresh or toasted, and reused days later. Stale bread was soaked in milk, fried, baked into casseroles, or toasted with baking grease and eaten with salt. One of the most common creations was cornmeal mush. Just cornmeal, water, and salt. Cooked slowly until thick. Served hot for breakfast, or cold and sliced the next day to fry in lard. Sometimes eaten with a dab of syrup, but often plain. Cheap, filling, and endlessly repeatable. Cooks learned to make gravy out of nothing. Literally. Some were made from flour browned in a pan with lard or drippings. Then water was slowly added, and stirred until it thickened into something that looked rich, even if it wasn't. This poor man's gravy was then poured over stale bread, over boiled potatoes, or over a scoop of rice. It added texture, moisture, and the illusion of flavor. With meat out of reach, beans became essential. Dried beans, navy, kidney, pinto, could be soaked overnight, boiled, and mashed. Families often seasoned them with nothing more than salt, maybe a spoonful of baking grease if it was available. In regions where meat trimmings could be scavenged, a single ham bone might be reused for an entire week's worth of bean pots. The bone would be boiled, dried, and reboiled until no flavor remained. Vegetables, if found, were stretched even further. Carrot tops were chopped and added to soups. Potato skins weren't discarded, they were boiled or fried. Onion peels flavored broth. Cabbage was a staple, cheap, filling, and available in many regions. Cabbage stew, cabbage and beans, fried cabbage, if it could be cooked with cabbage, it was. Even fruits were handled with surgical care. A single apple might be sliced 10 ways, shared between children. Peels were used in tea or simmered to add flavor to mush. Bananas were rarely seen, but if one turned brown, it might end up mashed into a Depression-era cake. These cakes were small, dense, and made without eggs, milk, or butter. Instead, vinegar and baking soda were used to make the batter rise. The result was edible, barely, and deeply appreciated. Another creation was rice with milk and sugar, a sweet dinner that doubled as dessert. When sugar wasn't available, families used molasses, corn syrup, or sometimes just a splash of salt water. In place of milk, water thickened with flour gave the illusion of cream. It was a trick of texture more than taste. But it worked. Pasta became a poor family's friend. Macaroni was cheap. Boxes could be bought in bulk and stored for weeks. One famous dish was Hoover stew, boiled macaroni mixed with canned tomatoes, and sliced hot dogs or bologna when available. Sometimes, just the macaroni and tomato water stood in for the whole meal. Children didn't mind. It was hot. It was red. It was food. Desserts were rare, but they existed. Vinegar pie, for instance, was made with flour, sugar, and vinegar, mimicking the tang of lemon. Mock apple pie used Ritz crackers instead of apples, layered with cinnamon and sugar to fake a fruit filling. And sugar cookies were made without sugar, just flour, water, and a bit of fat, pressed into circles and baked until hard. Creative meals extended to meatless meats. Peanut loaf was a common recipe, mashed beans or peanut butter mixed with oats, spices, and flour, then baked like a meatloaf. It had the texture of meat, sort of. Enough to fool a child if you didn't explain. Eggs were sometimes simulated with cornstarch and water. Milk was replaced with powdered versions or canned, evaporated milk, stretched thin. Even coffee was stretched. Grounds were reused multiple times. Some boiled chicory root, roasted grain, or even acorns to simulate the bitterness. The goal wasn't the flavor. It was the ritual. The comfort of sipping something warm. Families also learned to preserve aggressively. Canning was not a hobby, it was survival. Peaches, tomatoes, beans, and corn were jarred and shelved in cool cellars. Pickling became popular. Cucumbers, beets, even eggs were pickled. Anything that could be fermented or sealed was put away for the winter. A jar of canned peaches in January could be the highlight of the season. Children waited months to taste that syrupy bite. Creativity wasn't always about invention, it was often about attitude. Mothers turned bland meals into games. Tonight, we're having invisible pie. Or, magic meatloaf. It helped children cope with the monotony. And it helped parents mask their own despair. Food was more than fuel. It was morale. And keeping morale high took real talent. Many Depression-era cooks passed down their recipes, not because they were delicious, but because they were proof of survival. They became family traditions. Grandma's water pie. Great-Aunt May's bean bread. These dishes weren't just edible. They were symbolic. Evidence that when times were hard, people figured it out. And perhaps the most powerful recipe was this: whatever you have plus something to cook it and plus someone to share it with equals dinner. Even if it was just boiled dough and salt. When you sit at a table and look down at a plate, you expect something to be what it looks like. Meatloaf is meatloaf. Pie is pie. A roast is exactly what it appears to be, a cut of meat roasted slowly to feed the family. But during the Great Depression, food became an illusion. You could look at something on a plate and only guess what it was pretending to be. This was the era of mock foods, clever, desperate imitations of the meals people used to know. The Great Depression didn't just empty stomachs, it emptied pantries, markets, butcher shops, and bakeries. What had once been standard fare, chicken dinners, buttered biscuits, pork roasts, became rare sights. But the memory of those meals lingered. People still craved them. They still talked about them. And so, rather than mourn their absence, they began to recreate them in spirit, using whatever they had. Mock foods were not novelties. They weren't fancy or artistic. They were born from necessity. These dishes were culinary camouflage, visual and textural illusions meant to convince the eater, just for a few moments, that the Depression hadn't taken everything. That this wasn't a hunk of boiled flour pretending to be meat. That this wasn't a cracker pretending to be apple pie. Let's begin with one of the most famous, mock apple pie. It had no apples. No fruit of any kind. Instead, crushed Ritz crackers, or saltines were layered with a syrup made from water, sugar, and lemon juice, then baked inside a pastry shell with a dusting of cinnamon. Remarkably, when cooked, the crackers absorbed the liquid and took on a texture startlingly similar to cooked apple slices. Blindfold someone, and they might not know the difference. That was the point. It was an edible lie. A small trick of taste and texture to satisfy a sweet tooth when apples were far too expensive. Then came mock chicken legs, also known as city chicken. Despite the name, there was no chicken. The dish consisted of cubes of inexpensive meats, usually pork or veal scraps, threaded onto skewers to mimic the shape of a drumstick. These skewers were then breaded and baked or fried. In appearance, they looked like chicken legs. They even had a bone, sort of. But they were entirely constructed. A visual illusion meant to remind people of Sunday dinners they no longer had. Butter was another luxury, and many households turned to mock butter made from lard, colored with yellow food dye or even carrot juice. The spread looked the part and had a creamy texture. It didn't taste the same, not even close, but it smeared across toast well enough to pass. It was enough to convince the eyes, if not the tongue. Mock sausages were made from ground beans or oats, shaped into small patties or links, and pan-fried. Spices were added to trick the nose into sensing meat. Sage, pepper, garlic, anything strong enough to trigger the memory of flavor. When fried crisp, the outside resembled real sausage, though the inside crumbled like bean paste. Still, it was hot and familiar, and that was enough. For a fancier illusion, Some people made mock goose, a concoction of mashed potatoes, onions, breadcrumbs, and whatever fat was available, all packed into a loaf pan and baked until the top crisp. Cut into slices and served with brown gravy, made from water, lard, and flour. It resembled roasted meat in shape and smell. Mock goose was often served at holidays or gatherings when the family needed to feel like things were normal. It gave the illusion of a celebratory dish. Eggs were scarce, so cooks invented eggless recipes that mimicked the texture and binding power of eggs. Mashed bananas, vinegar, and even baking soda were used as substitutes. Pancakes made with flour, water, and baking powder rose enough to resemble the real thing. If you had molasses, you drizzled it on top. If not, you ate it plain and called it something cheerful: sunrise flapjacks, depression cakes, or miracle rounds. People also made mock cream, a whipped mixture of evaporated milk and sugar, or even a chilled blend of flour-thickened water sweetened with vanilla extract. It was spooned onto desserts or poured over bread pudding. It had little to do with cream, really, but it added moisture, a sense of decadence, and helped the illusion hold. One particularly unusual creation was water pie. It used a mixture of water, flour, sugar, and a little butter or lard to create a gelatinous, slightly sweet filling. Poured into a pie crust and baked, it resembled lemon custard, if you squinted. It was, quite literally, a dessert made out of nothing. But it worked. It reminded people of what they were missing. And it gave them something to share. One of the more clever tricks involved mock hamburgers, made by shaping mashed beans, rice, or oatmeal into patties. When fried, they developed a crust that resembled meat. Some people added a splash of ketchup or mustard for flavor. Bread was often unavailable, so the patties were served between two slices of fried potato, or wrapped in lettuce leaves, if those could be found. Even mock milkshakes existed. One common depression milkshake used blended ice, canned milk, if available, a pinch of sugar, and a drop of vanilla. In poorer homes, a cup of cold water stirred with sugar and cocoa powder had to suffice. Children believed it was a treat. It was cold. It was brown. And it was made with love. Why did people go through the trouble to create these illusions? It wasn't just about flavor. It was about memory. About morale. About holding on to normalcy in a world that had stopped making sense. When you served your family a mock meal, you weren't just feeding them. You were feeding the memory of better days, and the hope that those days might return. Mock foods were also used as teaching tools for children. Parents used the meals to teach resourcefulness, gratitude, and the art of making do. Children learned how to grind oats, how to stretch a pot of stew, how to create something out of nothing. These lessons stayed with them long after the Depression ended. Many continued cooking mock recipes into the 1940s and 50s, not because they had to, but because it reminded them of family resilience. There's something deeply human about turning scarcity into ritual. Mock food was more than an imitation, it was a statement. A declaration that you hadn't given up. That you could still sit at a table, still share a laugh over invisible pie, still pretend a spoonful of mashed beans was meat. And strangely enough, some of those Depression recipes survived. In cookbooks. In handwritten recipe cards. In the voices of grandmothers recalling how they fed a family of 6 with 1 can of tomatoes and a box of saltines. Mock food might have started as a trick, but it became a legacy. A kind of culinary resilience passed down through kitchens, memories, and the simple act of pretending things were just a little better than they really were. When the grocery store shelves were bare, and the paycheck stopped coming, assuming it had ever existed at all, American families turned inward. They looked to their kitchens, their gardens, and their wild surroundings. Not for luxuries, not even for the basics, but for survival. In the Great Depression, food preservation wasn't a hobby, a trend, or a quaint return to tradition. It was an urgent, daily necessity. And 3 words came to define the difference between hunger and hope: canning, preserving, and foraging. Let's start with canning, the quiet ritual of bottling the harvest, sealing it with care. and storing it for months that would offer nothing but cold winds and empty fields. The sound of lids popping sealed was not just satisfying, it was security. Canning in the 1930s was no small feat. It required jars, lids, time, and knowledge passed down through generations. Entire afternoons were spent in overheated kitchens boiling peaches, tomatoes, green beans, corn, or whatever else was available. Fruits were preserved in light sugar syrup, vegetables in salt water or vinegar brine. Meat, if canned at all, had to be pressure cooked, a dangerous and intimidating process without the right equipment. Most homes didn't have refrigerators. And even if they did, electricity was unreliable. Canning was how you created your own backup plan. A well-stocked pantry, with rows of clear jars filled with glowing orange carrots, golden corn, ruby red preserves, that was as close as you could get to peace of mind. Families kept root cellars, cool, damp underground rooms where canned goods, onions, potatoes, and turnips could be stored through the winter. Some jars were labeled, some not. You might open what looked like peaches only to find stewed squash. It didn't matter. Food was food. Canning bees, neighborhood events, where women gathered to preserve food together, were common in rural communities. It was part work, part social gathering. Everyone brought what they had, baskets of fruit, armloads of beans, or simply strong hands for peeling and slicing. Children played nearby. The smell of boiling fruit filled the air. And by the end of the day, everyone left with jars in hand and a little more confidence that they might make it through another season. Then there was preserving, which went beyond canning. This included drying, salting, fermenting, and pickling, methods older than the country itself. When salt was available, it was worth its weight in gold. Meat could be salted, buried, hung, and smoked to last longer. Cabbage became sauerkraut. Cucumbers turned into pickles. Eggs were stored in lime water. Even butter was preserved by packing it tightly in salt or burying it in cold storage. Drying was the simplest and cheapest method of all. Apples, peaches, green beans, and corn were sliced and laid out in the sun or dried over low heat on a stove. Hung on screens, strung from thread, or laid on newspapers, the goal was to remove enough moisture so that mold couldn't grow. Dried beans and peas were also staple items, stored in cloth bags or old coffee tins to be boiled later. Every scrap was used. If there were extra beets, their greens were saved for soups. Peels from apples were boiled into jelly. Nothing went to waste. In fact, waste was a concept people couldn't afford. A bruised pear wasn't rotten, it was jam. Overripe tomatoes became sauce. Cores and pits were often boiled for flavor. Even orange peels were candied in syrup if sugar could be spared. But when even that wasn't enough, people turned to foraging, the practice of gathering wild food from the land. It wasn't romantic or quaint. It was simply what had to be done. Children were taught to recognize dandelion greens, which appeared early in spring and were packed with nutrients. They were eaten raw, boiled, or added to soups. Pokeweed, nettles, wild onions, and lamb's quarters were gathered in the woods and fields. Some had to be cooked carefully to avoid toxins. Families passed down this knowledge like recipes. Eat this, not that. Always boil this first. Never pick that after the flowers bloom. Wild berries were prized. Blackberries, raspberries, gooseberries, whatever was in season. Children returned home with purple-stained fingers and buckets not quite full. Some were eaten fresh, some turned into jam or cobbler, and some dried to be rehydrated in winter. Even tree bark wasn't off limits. Slippery elm was chewed for sustenance. Acorns, once properly leached of their bitterness, were ground into flour. Chicory root was dug up, roasted, and brewed as a coffee substitute. People also fished and hunted, where possible. Rabbits, squirrels, and even opossums ended up in stews. Not because people wanted to eat them, but because they were available, and meat was meat. In some regions, turtles were caught, and their meat preserved in jars. Crayfish were trapped in streams. Wild eggs were collected from nests. Urban foraging looked different. City dwellers dug through markets at the end of the day for discarded vegetables. Children might scavenge bread scraps from bakery bins. Some families foraged in vacant lots for weeds that could be cooked. Pigeons were occasionally caught and cooked. In hard times, judgment faded. You did what you had to do. Preservation also came in the form of recipes. People began collecting and sharing formulas that worked. How to pickle watermelon rind, how to preserve green tomatoes, how to dry corn in a pillowcase. Neighbors exchanged handwritten notes. Entire community cookbooks were compiled and printed by churches or women's groups, filled with suggestions for stretching meals, saving food, and surviving hunger. These skills, once common, slowly disappeared in later decades. As supermarkets became the norm and food grew more abundant, fewer people remembered how to can, preserve, or forage. But during the Great Depression, these were sacred arts. The difference between a full stomach and an empty night. Between despair and just a little bit of control. Mothers taught daughters. Fathers taught sons. Neighbors helped neighbors. Survival wasn't individual, it was collective. People shared their pickles. They exchanged canned beans for jam. They knocked on doors and offered a jar of stew for a handful of dried apples. The act of putting something away, sealing it in a jar, drying it on a line, burying it in salt, was more than a preservation method. It was hope bottled and stored. A quiet belief that tomorrow might be just a little easier. That winter wouldn't win. That hunger, though fierce, could be outwitted with patience, skill, and the stubborn will to survive. And so, rows of jars stood in cellars, like silent sentinels. Baskets of dried apples hung in pantries. Salted meat cured in sheds. And families, though hungry, pressed forward, preserving not only food, but dignity, tradition, and the fragile thread of life. When the cupboard was empty, and the sky looked like another day without rain, many parents faced a daily decision that chipped away at their hearts, whether they could send their children to school hungry, or at all. During the Great Depression, millions of American families were scraping the bottom of every barrel, both literal and emotional. And while some help arrived, it often came late, inconsistently, and only in the thinnest trickles. Still, for many, the only reliable food in a child's day came not from home, but from a school lunch program funded by emergency government aid, local charities, and determined communities. The 1930s were a strange paradox in American life. Vast fields of crops rotted in place due to market collapse, while children starved in cities and rural towns alike. Farmers were being paid not to plant in order to reduce surplus, while soup kitchens grew crowded and despondent. Against this backdrop, hunger wasn't just a result of drought or bad luck, it was structural. Families did everything they could. But sometimes that simply wasn't enough. In this climate, schools became lifelines. Not because they were designed to be, but because they had to be. As the government slowly began to acknowledge the magnitude of the crisis, emergency food relief became part of the broader recovery strategy. One of the first serious federal efforts to tackle child hunger came through the Works Progress Administration, WPA, and the Federal Surplus Relief Corporation, FSRC, both launched under President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. These programs were created to distribute surplus food to schools, charitable organizations, and low-income families. At the same time, they provided jobs for out-of-work adults, many of whom were hired as school cooks, custodians, and lunch program coordinators. In doing so, the government hit two birds with one desperate, overcooked stone: feed the hungry and provide employment. By 1935, over 3,000 counties in the United States were participating in some form of federally supported school lunch program. The meals were meager, often repetitive, and depended entirely on what the government could spare, or what could be salvaged from local farms and donations. But for many children, this was the only meal of the day. Some walked miles through sleet or snow for it. Others sat through entire school days with growling stomachs just to reach lunchtime. What did these lunches look like? They were usually simple, hot, and based on whatever was available in bulk. A bowl of thick bean soup with cornbread. Stewed tomatoes over rice. Macaroni with powdered cheese or a bit of lard stirred in for fat. Creamed vegetables over biscuits. Occasionally, there might be milk if surplus dairy had arrived. Sweets were rare, though a slice of apple, when available, or some bread spread with syrup, might be offered. Some children brought their own food from home. Not a lunchbox in the modern sense, but perhaps a jar of cold beans, a piece of leftover fried dough, or a slice of bread with lard. Those who had nothing often waited for leftovers, or simply hoped that the school cook made enough. In many small towns, teachers secretly pooled their own money to buy ingredients for lunch. Others worked with local mothers, who volunteered to cook whatever could be donated. In cities, soup kitchens often extended to children by partnering with nearby schools. Hot meals were carried by volunteers from kitchens to classrooms, often underfunded and overcrowded. Some urban schools built their own kitchens, staffed by women hired through WPA programs. These kitchens were hardly gourmet, many lacked ovens, hot water, or storage, but they worked. Even the act of handing a child a warm bowl of stew was transformative. It was nourishment, yes, but also dignity. These programs didn't just feed, they taught. Alongside lunch, some schools began offering home economics and nutrition classes to children. Students learned about basic cooking, cleanliness, and how to stretch a meal for a whole family. These skills were not hypothetical, they were urgent life lessons. But the reach of school lunch programs was limited. In rural areas, children often couldn't make it to school due to long distances, lack of clothing or shoes, or simply because their families needed them to work. In these households, food relief had to come from government surplus programs, which distributed staples like dried beans, flour, canned meat, cheese, and powdered milk to communities in need. Families might stand in line for hours to receive a bag of flour or a box of dried eggs. Often these distributions were irregular. One week might bring beans, the next nothing. Some recipients had to prove destitution to qualify, a humiliating process that deterred many. Local charity organizations filled the gaps, but their resources were stretched to the limit. Then came the Commodity Distribution Program, part of Roosevelt's agricultural stabilization efforts. The government bought surplus food from struggling farmers and redistributed it to schools, shelters, and poor families. In theory, this helped everyone: the farmer, the child, the unemployed parent. In practice, it was spotty. Some towns saw regular deliveries. Others waited months. For many children, these school meals were the first time they tasted foods outside their limited family diet. A child from a dust-ridden Oklahoma farm might try boiled cabbage for the first time. Another from a mining town in Pennsylvania might discover macaroni. These tastes became part of their memory, tied forever to the classroom, the smell of chalk, and the warmth of lunch steam rising on a winter day. There were critics of these programs too. Some worried that government handouts would make people lazy. Others argued that public schools weren't meant to be kitchens. But the reality on the ground spoke louder than ideology. Hunger didn't care about politics. And neither did the children. By the late 1930s, the impact of school lunches and food aid was undeniable. Teachers noted improved attendance and focus. Parents sent their children with pride, knowing they'd come home with something in their bellies. And in kitchens and classrooms across the country, a new understanding began to form: food was a right, not just a privilege. These early school lunch programs laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the National School Lunch Act of 1946. But in the Depression years, they were fragile, improvised, and always under threat of disappearance. Still, they endured, bowl by bowl, sandwich by sandwich. For the children who lived through the Great Depression, the memory of those lunches lingered for life. They remembered the smell of warm beans, the scrape of a metal spoon on a chipped bowl, the relief of sitting down to something hot after hours of cold. And they remembered the quiet gratitude not just for the food, but for the people who made sure it was there. The teachers, the cooks, the anonymous donors. Because in the end, the thin safety net was woven not just from policy, but from kindness. From the belief that every child deserved at least one meal a day. And that sometimes, the smallest bowl of soup could carry the greatest weight of hope. Imagine trying to cook a meal in a place where the land itself has stopped producing. Where the soil has turned to dust, the rain has stopped falling, and every window you open lets in a fresh coat of gray powder on your table. Now imagine trying to raise a family, put food on plates, and survive day after day in that setting. Welcome to the Dust Bowl. Between 1930 and 1940, much of the American Great Plains was transformed into a kind of slow-motion disaster zone. Over-farming, overgrazing, and a lack of crop rotation had stripped the topsoil. Then came the droughts. No rain for months. Then years. The winds picked up what was left and flung it across the sky. Black clouds of dust rolled over farms and towns, choking the air and burying fence posts. This was not just an environmental crisis. It was a culinary one. What people ate during the Dust Bowl years was shaped entirely by what wasn't there. Crops failed. Livestock died. Even gardens struggled, as soil erosion and constant windstorms destroyed delicate roots and kept plants from flourishing. The typical hearty meals of farm life, roast chicken, cornbread, boiled vegetables, pies made from orchard apples, were replaced by foods that were less nourishing and more strategic. Dust Bowl dinners were frugal, repetitive, and often unsettling. People ate what was left, what could be traded, or what the government occasionally distributed. Meals often included only one or two ingredients, repeated in different forms. A common staple was cornmeal. Even when wheat fields failed, some corn could survive the harsh conditions. It was ground and used to make mush, porridge, flatbread, or fritters. Families ate cornmeal 3 times a day. Breakfast was cornmeal mush, boiled and thin. Lunch might be fried mush cakes, and dinner a thicker version with lard if they had any. Beans, when available, were prized for their protein. Dried beans could be boiled into soup, mashed into patties, or stirred into cornbread to stretch the meal. Some families cooked beans all week, keeping the pot going, adding water, and whatever scraps they could. Meat was rare, unless a chicken died or a jackrabbit was caught. Rabbits were both a blessing and a curse. In some areas, their numbers exploded as natural predators disappeared. Locals organized rabbit drives, herding hundreds of rabbits into enclosures, and killing them en masse. The meat was lean and tough but edible. Rabbit stew became a common, if grim, feature of Dust Bowl kitchens. People also turned to creative substitutions. Potato peel pie, for example, used just the skins, seasoned with salt and baked to create the illusion of a filling dish. Bread was made without yeast or flour when needed. Instead, families used crushed beans, wild greens, or cornmeal mixed with baking powder and water. The Dust Bowl's omnipresent enemy was the dust itself. It wasn't just outside, it was everywhere. It seeped through cracks, collected on plates, floated into cooking pots. No matter how carefully a woman covered her dough, a thin layer of grit would settle on it. Bread had a crunch. Stew had texture it wasn't supposed to have. Families kept wet towels on windowsills, nailed oilcloth over door frames, and hung sheets around kitchen tables to try and keep the dust out, often in vain. Water was another issue. Wells dried up. What water could be drawn was often alkaline, or contaminated with dirt. It made cooking harder, and sickness more common. Some homes boiled the same water repeatedly, trying to clean it. Even washing vegetables, if you had them, became risky business. Despite the hardship, Dust Bowl families leaned on tradition and resourcefulness. Canning was impossible during a drought, so families focused on dry storage. Foods were buried in cool areas, hung in burlap sacks, or packed in ash to preserve them. Bread was baked only on certain days to conserve fuel. Wood was scarce, and coal even more so. Some burned corn cobs or dried manure, anything that would burn without smoke. School lunches, if available, were lifelines. WPA supported kitchens served beans, stewed tomatoes, or corn mush. Children lined up quietly, bowls in hand, knowing this might be their only meal that day. Some schools handed out slices of bread, with sugar or jam. Others distributed surplus canned foods from the government, sometimes unrecognizable, always appreciated. Community potlucks, despite being humble, became important morale boosters. Everyone brought what little they could, a jar of pickles, a handful of dried beans, some home-churned butter, and it was pooled into a shared meal. Churches often hosted them, pairing a bowl of soup with sermons about resilience and faith. Notably, Dust Bowl food traditions became intertwined with migration stories. As families left Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas in search of better conditions, many headed west toward California. They took their food habits with them. Canned beans, cornmeal, biscuits fried in bacon grease, and boiled greens followed these families to migrant camps and roadside shanty towns. Okie cooking became its own subculture, built on hunger, mobility, and adaptation. Cookbooks of the time started including depression meals, specifically for Dust Bowl conditions. Recipes like mock meatloaf, made of mashed beans, and leftover oats, drought pudding, water, cornstarch, and sugar, and dirtless stew for days when dust was simply unavoidable, weren't jokes, they were coping mechanisms. And through it all, mothers, grandmothers, and even children found a way to hold on to rituals. Sunday dinner still happened, even if it was just a pot of boiled turnips. Holidays were marked with special foods, a hand-pulled taffy at Christmas, a single egg saved for Easter cake. Even a spoonful of molasses might be divided among 6 children to celebrate a birthday. In oral histories, Dust Bowl survivors often speak less about the taste of their meals, and more about the acts surrounding them, the preparation, the ingenuity, the gathering of family at the table despite everything. Food was rarely satisfying, but it was sacred. Even when it was little more than cornmeal mush dusted with sand. And perhaps what defined Dust Bowl meals most was the silence. Not just from hunger, but from awe. The quiet of a family eating in the glow of a kerosene lamp, wind howling outside, dust creeping in. Each bite was a defiance of nature. Each swallowed spoonful a tiny victory. These were not gourmet meals. They were not healthy by modern standards. But they were fuel, for the body, for the spirit, for the long days ahead. Dust Bowl food was not just about what people ate. It was about how they survived when everything around them seemed to be vanishing into the wind. In a time when a dime could be the difference between hunger and survival, walking into a grocery store during the Great Depression felt like entering a world where you didn't quite belong. The shelves still held cans, sacks, and jars, arranged neatly, prices chalked in big, hopeful numbers. But for many, they were just that, numbers, dreams, out of reach. Even the act of browsing took courage, especially when your pockets jingled with only a few coins, or none at all. Grocery stores, corner shops, general stores, these were community fixtures, often run by someone who had known every family in the neighborhood for years. And during the Depression, these store owners became reluctant social workers. They extended credit lines far past reason, let IOUs pile up in notebooks, and often handed out flour or beans just because they couldn't bear to say no. But even generosity had limits. The country was cash-starved. Banks were failing. Farmers couldn't sell crops, and workers couldn't find jobs. Money barely moved. So when groceries couldn't be bought with cash, people turned to barter, a centuries-old system suddenly resurrected by modern desperation. Bartering became the unofficial economy of the Depression. People traded eggs for sugar, chickens for coffee, canned peaches for soap, and labor for meat scraps. A woman might mend a storekeeper's coat in exchange for a sack of potatoes. A boy might sweep the sidewalk in return for a tin of condensed milk. Goods and services flowed without currency, held together by trust, need, and a shared understanding that everyone was doing what they had to do. In rural towns, bartering networks became highly organized. Communities held swap days, where people brought whatever they had: homemade butter, wild herbs, a few pieces of firewood, handmade clothes, and exchanged them. There was no haggling, just mutual accommodation. No one came to get rich. They came to get through the week. Even towns without official barter days created systems out of necessity. Storekeepers might keep boxes behind the counter with community items: a pair of shoes, a few eggs, some canned fruit. If you left something of value, you could take something else in return. It wasn't quite charity, and it wasn't quite commerce. It was survival, built on flexibility and thin margins. But for every makeshift trade and good-hearted exchange, there were also darker economies taking shape. The Depression, after all, didn't erase human ambition or desperation. It just redirected them. Enter the black market. Hidden in alleys, basements, back rooms, and behind the facade of legitimate businesses, the black market became the place where you could find what had disappeared from shelves at a price. In the early 1930s, it wasn't uncommon for merchants to hold back certain items, like sugar, meat, or coffee, and sell them off the books to customers who could pay extra. Prices were high. Quality wasn't guaranteed. But people paid anyway. If you had a sick child or a visiting relative, you might buy a loaf of bakery bread under the table, even if it cost 3 times as much. Black market goods also included bootleg food, items made at home and sold quietly: moonshine, of course, but also home canned meat, pickled vegetables, and butter churned in back kitchens. Local authorities often turned a blind eye. After all, enforcing the law didn't fill empty bellies. Then there were the traveling merchants, peddlers, traders, or eggmen, who went door to door selling items from wagons or trucks. Sometimes they carried produce from outside the Dust Bowl, or surplus food from neighboring towns. Their prices were steep, but their presence was sometimes the only way a family saw a fresh apple that month. Urban black markets were more elaborate. In large cities like New York or Chicago, entire neighborhoods had underground economies. Tenement basements might host informal bakeries. Illegal butcher shops operated after hours. Leftover scraps from restaurants were gathered, repackaged, and sold at night markets. Immigrant communities especially relied on these networks, not just for survival, but to access traditional ingredients no longer stocked in stores. Despite the risks, the black market thrived in part because it filled the gaps left by formal institutions. Government relief programs were overwhelmed, slow, and bureaucratic. Food banks and churches ran out of donations. So when a neighbor offered you flour, borrowed from a back room, or a piece of beef from a questionably sourced cow, you didn't ask questions. You said thank you. And yet, not all black market activity was shady. In many cases, it was simply informal. Housewives shared jars of lard with neighbors. A retired baker made bread for a few families, and accepted whatever they could spare in return: a bag of coal, a chicken, or mending work. These exchanges weren't illegal, just unrecorded. Another key player in these economic side channels was the community grocer. These small business owners often walked a tightrope. They needed to sell to stay afloat, but their customers couldn't pay. So many kept informal tabs, handwritten ledgers that tracked who owed what. Some of these debts stretched years, and many were never collected. It was the cost of compassion. Sometimes, grocers allowed children to come in with notes from their mothers: "Please send a loaf of bread, we'll pay Friday." Often, the Friday payment never came. But the bread still did. The grocer understood. Everyone did. To help deal with shortages, communities also created cooperatives, pooling money or resources to buy food in bulk. These co-ops reduced prices and gave participants a sense of ownership. Some were formal. Others were as simple as a few neighbors sharing a large sack of flour. And as desperate as people were, many still insisted on fairness. One woman might trade 4 eggs for a pound of sugar, but not 5. A neighbor might loan a can of peaches but expect it to be returned later. Trust was a form of currency. It moved more freely than dollars. Over time, this entire underground system became a kind of living organism, a shadow economy based on survival, adaptability, and deeply personal relationships. It was rarely efficient, never luxurious, and always unstable. But it worked. At least for a while. By the end of the Depression, many families still carried debts they couldn't repay. Some storekeepers had gone out of business after too many IOUs. But what remained was the memory of a strange, barter-heavy, semi-legal world where food wasn't just something you bought. It was something you earned, negotiated, shared, or traded for. And it was in those quiet backrooms, sidewalk exchanges, and handwritten ledgers that you could find a kind of economy that wasn't measured in profits, but in people's resilience. Because when the official systems broke down, ordinary Americans didn't wait. They adapted. They traded. They survived. Not just through soup lines or government aid, but through each other. When you're truly hungry, not peckish, not skipping lunch, but deep in your bones hungry, your body and mind begin to change. Food becomes an obsession. A shadow at the edge of every thought. In the Great Depression, for millions, this was a daily state of being. So people adapted, not only by stretching meals or making substitutions, but sometimes by turning to the bizarre, the experimental, and even the dangerous. This was a time of strange food choices, some born out of desperation, others out of hope, and some, oddly enough, out of misplaced optimism. And hovering around it all was a peculiar intersection of poverty and pseudoscience, the rise of Depression-era fad diets, odd nutrition theories, and meals that could charitably be described as experimental. First, let's start with the desperation. People ate what they had. And when the pantry was bare, they expanded the definition of food itself. Children chewed raw turnips like apples. Adults boiled dandelion greens, purslane, pigweed, or nettles, plants we might call weeds today. These were foraged in fields, ditches, and the edges of city lots. Cooked with lard or onion, they became a bitter, leafy stew. Sometimes families roasted acorns to make a coarse flour. They soaked and boiled them to remove bitterness, a laborious process. Others dried corn husks, ground them, and mixed them with bits of sorghum or baking grease to make a gritty kind of pancake. People also turned to parts of animals rarely eaten before. Tongue, kidney, tripe, brains. If it could be stewed, fried, or ground into sausage, it made it to the table. Pig's feet and oxtail, formerly tossed aside or sold for pennies, became delicacies born of necessity. In cities, butchers quietly sold meat scraps, bones, and even animal skin to customers with little money and big families. And then there were the truly odd meals, born from trying to make something, anything, taste like a remembered feast. There was ketchup soup, which was exactly what it sounds like: hot water, a few squirts of ketchup, and maybe a spoonful of margarine. A little salt if you had it. Onion sandwiches, a slice of raw onion between two pieces of bread, sometimes with a smear of mustard or lard, were another staple. So was mock apple pie, made not from apples, but from crackers, sugar, and lemon juice. The idea was to mimic the texture and flavor of apples using Ritz crackers. It didn't work, but it filled a crust, and that was often enough. Milk toast was a common comfort food, bread soaked in warm milk and butter, eaten with a spoon. It was easy to digest, cheap, and vaguely nourishing. In homes where milk was scarce, water toast took its place, plain white bread soaked in hot water with sugar or baking grease. But even amid scarcity, America's obsession with health persisted. Which brings us to the strange intersection of fad diets and hunger. During the 1930s, while millions were skipping meals involuntarily, others were experimenting with new nutritional theories. Newspapers ran columns on how to eat light and healthy on a budget. Magazines promoted miracle foods, from grapefruit to celery juice, promising weight loss, energy, and mental clarity. Some of this came from the rise of scientific dieting, which emerged in the 1920s and evolved alongside Depression-era anxieties. The idea was that certain food combinations were superior, or that eliminating specific items could enhance digestion or cure ailments. Books like The Hay Diet and The Zone System gained popularity, preaching rules like, never eat protein and starch together, or, wait 4 hours between fruit and meat. In a time of hunger, it might seem bizarre that anyone would restrict food voluntarily. But for the middle class, those not yet completely destitute, these ideas offered a sense of control in a chaotic world. If you couldn't control the economy, you could at least manage your digestion. More troubling were the medical fads, diets that claimed to cure depression, tuberculosis, or even cancer. Some promoted all-potato diets. Others warned against nightshade vegetables or acid-forming grains. One popular suggestion was to consume raw eggs, mixed with molasses every morning to combat fatigue. Another was the vinegar diet, involving daily spoonfuls of apple cider vinegar mixed with honey and hot water. But none were as widespread as the so-called grapefruit diet, sometimes dubbed the Hollywood diet. Popularized in newspapers, it claimed that eating grapefruit with every meal could melt away pounds and cleanse the body. For those who could afford citrus, it became a fad, not just among celebrities but among desperate housewives, trying to stretch rations while still looking presentable. Ironically, for many poor Americans, the Depression diet unintentionally became fashionable. As waistlines shrank from necessity, so did the cultural ideal of thinness. Magazines featured slender women in tea dresses, attributing their looks to discipline and smart eating, while real women went hungry in silence. Of course, not all food experimentation came from pseudoscience. Some of it was simple improvisation. Families combined whatever was left in the cupboard and hoped it made something edible. Everything stew, sometimes called depression goulash, was a mix of noodles, beans, vegetables, bread scraps, and meat if you had it. Every batch was different. Every bowl a surprise. There was also a tendency to stretch everything. A single egg might be used across an entire loaf of bread. A cup of flour patted with oats or mashed potato. Canned tomato soup diluted 3-to-1 with water. Kids might be told to chew slowly, to make food last longer. And in some homes, odd rules emerged, passed down like ritual. Never throw out bacon grease. Save chicken bones for broth, then dry them for kindling. Use coffee grounds twice. Reuse tea bags. One child might eat only crusts, the other middles, so nothing was wasted. By the late 1930s, nutritionists and home economists tried to step in. Government pamphlets circulated with titles like, How to Eat Well on Little, or Menus for Tough Times. These included ideas for meatless meals, liver recipes, and ways to cook dried beans without fuel waste. It was helpful advice, though many recipients already knew it by heart. And despite all the strangeness, the ketchup soups, vinegar drinks, onion sandwiches, and weed stews, one thing stands out in Depression food culture: people kept trying. They experimented not just to survive, but to reclaim a bit of flavor, dignity, and variety. A mother who made mock chicken from mashed beans and broth wasn't fooling anyone. But she was telling her kids, without words, I'm still trying to take care of you. In the end, these odd foods weren't just strange, they were deeply human. They were a mixture of hope, habit, necessity, and a little stubborn belief that something good could still come from the worst of times. That even in an era of dust and hunger, there was room for invention. And sometimes, that invention looked like apple pie made out of crackers, eaten slowly, gratefully, on a borrowed plate. It was one thing to find food during the Great Depression. It was another thing entirely to make it last. Every bite counted. Every crumb, every spoonful, every spoon. Food wasn't just something you cooked. It was something you rationed, stretched, protected, and planned like a general organizing troops for a long, losing battle. Families became experts at preservation, portioning, and pretending. And behind every simple Depression-era meal was often an intricate logic of how to make it stretch to tomorrow, and maybe the day after that. First, there was stretching meals, the foundational survival tactic of the Great Depression kitchen. If a recipe called for 1 egg, you used half and added a spoonful of cornstarch. If you had a cup of milk, you mixed it with water. Bread was bulked out with oatmeal. Meatloaf was filled with breadcrumbs, stale crackers, or even grated carrot, not for nutrition, but for mass. Leftovers weren't just reheated, they were reborn. Sunday's stew became Monday's soup. Tuesday's soup was poured over Wednesday's boiled rice. Thursday, it might become a thin gravy for potato cakes. By Friday, the pot was more memory than meal. But the pot never stopped being used. Portion control was a family-wide ritual. The food went on the table already divided. Children learned early to eat slowly, to not ask for seconds, and to act full even when they weren't. A single biscuit might be split 3 ways. A ladle of soup would be measured precisely, not out of cruelty, but necessity. Mothers often served themselves last, and sometimes not at all. There were tricks, too, small psychological maneuvers to make a little food feel like more. Serving meals in smaller bowls, using thick-bottomed mugs, or cutting sandwiches into many small triangles. One family told their children that if they chewed each bite 30 times, it would taste richer. Some mothers added extra water to the soup while it was on the table, slowly and quietly, to stretch what was left. Many Depression-era cooks developed their own rules and patterns to make things stretch. Mondays might be for beans. Tuesdays for rice. Wednesday was bread and gravy. Thursday was soup night, the night for everything that hadn't been eaten yet. Friday, something sweet, maybe molasses candy or bread pudding made from stale slices. Then there was preservation. In towns and farms across America, people revived or relied more heavily on the old ways: canning, drying, salting, fermenting, smoking, pickling cucumbers and onions, salting pork, drying apples in attic rafters. A whole science of survival lived in basements and root cellars. Even in cities, people canned fruit on back porches and stored jars under beds. But preservation wasn't just about storing, it was about guarding. Mice were a constant threat. So were mold, heat, and thieves. A single spoiled jar of canned beans was a minor tragedy. Many families stored their food under lock and key, literally, small pantries secured by hooks, trunks hidden behind furniture. Even with all this care, some families simply didn't have enough to preserve in the first place. So instead, they turned to ritualized rationing systems to make little things feel like enough. Sugar, for example, might be portioned into a weekly allowance. The jar was watched, measured, and guarded more fiercely than money. A single teaspoon for tea, a sprinkle for porridge, a reward on Saturday. Many also developed emergency meals, fallback foods saved only for the worst days. A can of evaporated milk, a stash of rice, or one last cube of bouillon. These were hoarded, revered, and protected, not to be touched until absolutely necessary. When finally eaten, they carried with them a strange mix of shame and relief. Another tactic: rotation cooking. One day's ingredients influence the next. If you opened a can of tomatoes on Monday, the rest must be used by Wednesday. If bread was baked, the stale ends became breadcrumbs by week's end. Bacon fat was saved in jars and used for frying potatoes or beans days later. There were even forms of illusion. For instance, one family swore by milk sauce, which was actually flour, salt, and water whisked to look creamy. Poured over vegetables, it mimicked richness. Others added yellow food coloring to mashed potatoes to suggest butter. Clever cooks learned to substitute creatively. Vinegar for lemon. Lard for butter. Boiled coffee grounds for fresh coffee. Gelatin from bones as dessert. There were even cookbooks published on these tactics: Cooking on a Shoestring, Victory Meals, and 50 Ways to Serve Beans. Then came the art of sharing to survive. Food was often pooled with neighbors or extended family. If one family had a bit of meat and the other had vegetables, a stew could be shared. This wasn't just kindness, it was a survival pact. No one wanted to be alone in hunger. Not just for the sake of food, but for the sake of morale. And speaking of morale, that may be the most underrated ingredient of all. Families created little rituals to make meals feel more normal, even when they weren't. Setting the table carefully. Saying grace before soup and bread. Singing a song before dessert, even if dessert was just sugar sprinkled on toast. Pretending, in a way, that food would last, even if it wouldn't. And yes, there were the dark days. The days when there wasn't anything left to stretch. When all the tactics had been used, all the jars were empty, and there was nothing left to rotate, preserve, or ration. On those days, families made pretend meals. Water tea. Bread crust boiled into a broth. A spoonful of jam passed from child to child like communion. But even then, they sat at the table. They used forks. They told stories. And the illusion of normalcy helped them hold on, until a neighbor knocked on the door with a few potatoes, or the garden yielded 2 squash, or payday came again. In these quiet, invisible ways, stretching meals, sharing spoons, measuring teaspoons of sugar, families not only made food last, they made hope last. Which, in the end, was often the most important thing on the table. In every Depression-era kitchen, behind the smell of boiling beans and scorched bread crusts, behind the clatter of mismatched plates, and the scrape of spoons on near-empty bowls, there lived something heavier than hunger. It was shame, guilt, pride, and memory, all folded into the act of eating. Food was never just food. It was dignity. It was failure. It was longing. It was hope bitter and boiled down to its barest broth. When food is scarce, every bite becomes symbolic. A crust of bread means survival, but it can also mean defeat. For a mother unable to feed her child enough, there was no comfort in a half-empty plate. There was guilt, gut level, unrelenting, and quiet. Many women of the Depression ate only after everyone else had. Many didn't eat at all. Not out of martyrdom, but out of a belief that it was their duty, that going hungry was simply the cost of being a mother. Fathers weren't spared either. Men who had worked their whole lives, in mines, factories, on railroads and farms, found themselves standing in bread lines, accepting handouts, bringing home donated food and canned goods handed out by charities. And with every tin of beans or sack of flour came an unspoken message: you cannot provide. Some men couldn't bear it. They vanished. Others grew silent. They sat at the table but barely chewed. Children remembered them staring into empty space as meals were served. They remembered the way their hands trembled when they passed the bread. Pride, it turned out, was harder to swallow than hunger. Food also became a battleground of shame and comparison. One family might have meat once a week. Another, only on holidays. Children noticed. School lunches were a cruel metric. One boy with a peanut butter sandwich. Another with just a biscuit. Girls who hid their lunches in napkins so others wouldn't see they had only plain bread. Teachers tried not to ask questions. They offered snacks quietly. But the shame was already thick in the room. For many children of the Depression, food became their earliest memory of inequality. Not just that there wasn't enough, but that some had more. They remembered the smells coming from neighbors' houses. Roasted chicken. Canned peaches. The clink of dishes, when guests were over. And they learned, in quiet silence, that food meant status. That a slice of pie or a second helping marked the line between fine and struggling. In the poorest households, the emotional weight of food created a culture of silence. You didn't complain about being hungry. You didn't ask for more. You said thank you, no matter what. Even if dinner was lard on bread, or soup made from onion peel. Gratitude was enforced, not because the food was good, but because there simply was food. Many children internalized this. For the rest of their lives, they would clean their plates. They would hoard crackers and peanut butter. They would feel a strange sadness throwing out leftovers, no matter how spoiled. They would never ask for seconds at a stranger's house, because inside them lived a small voice, echoing from a kitchen in 1933, saying, "This is all we have." And yet, strangely, food also carried memory in its gentlest, most nostalgic form. Years after the Depression ended, survivors would speak fondly of poverty dishes, fried cornmeal mush, vinegar pie, milk toast. These foods weren't just rations, they were reminders of endurance, of a mother who could turn stale bread into a soft dessert, of a grandmother who laughed while making onion stew for the third day in a row, of neighbors who shared what little they had. So many Depression survivors told the same story in different ways. That even in the hardest times, there was something sacred about the kitchen, about the way everyone came to the table, whether or not there was much to eat. That the clinking of spoons in a chipped bowl of soup felt like home. That even if dinner was only boiled cabbage, someone lit a candle anyway. But the trauma ran deep. Even decades later, Depression-era men and women reported feeling uneasy around food. They distrusted abundance, felt guilty at restaurants. Some couldn't bear to leave food on the plate, not out of manners, but because it triggered old, cold fears. A wasted bite wasn't just careless, it was dangerous. Others, paradoxically, developed food hoarding habits. Pantries filled with canned goods, closets full of rice and pasta. Not because they needed them, but because the thought of running out again was unbearable. Their children grew up thinking it was normal to keep 6 boxes of crackers and 20 cans of beans on hand. But to those who had once had nothing, it wasn't strange. It was peace of mind. There were also rituals of frugality that stayed long after the Depression ended. Washing and reusing foil, keeping bacon grease in coffee cans, cutting mold off cheese, saving pickle brine to reuse as vinegar. Some of these habits were passed down like heirlooms. Others faded with time. But for a generation that had once eaten onion sandwiches and bean water, waste was a sin. And even for those who left poverty behind, the emotional weight lingered. A successful businessman might still feel a pang when seeing a child throw out half a sandwich. A wealthy grandmother might serve plain soup in fine china. Because food wasn't just sustenance, it was a story. And Depression food carried all the chapters: hunger, pride, shame, strength, resilience, and love. Perhaps the most profound legacy of Depression food was its quiet emotional language. To make soup for someone was to care. To give them the last slice of bread was to love. To split a can of peaches 6 ways was to say, "You matter as much as anyone else at this table." That's what Depression survivors remembered most, not the meals themselves, but what they meant. The mother who hid her hunger behind a smile. The father who traded his coat for flour. The neighbor who left a basket of eggs at the door and never said a word. Food was memory. Food was emotion. And food, more than anything, was the thread that held fragile families together. Threadbare, yes, but still holding. If a person was hungry during the Great Depression, truly hungry, not just skipping meals, but watching days go by without food, they weren't alone. In cities, towns, and rural outposts, there were entire communities of hungry people. Children with hollow cheeks, old men shivering on stoops, mothers lining up with babies wrapped in threadbare quilts. And eventually, across this sea of hunger, something emerged that resembled both kindness and necessity: the community kitchen. Sometimes they were called soup kitchens, but that name misses the full picture. These places didn't just serve soup. They served dignity, warmth, a break from desperation, even if only for a bowl and a spoon's worth. Often, these kitchens were operated by churches, local charities, and volunteer groups. They popped up in church basements, school gymnasiums, shuttered restaurants, and wherever people could gather without being turned away. At first, they were funded by small donations. A farmer who could spare potatoes. A shopkeeper who had expired tins of tomatoes. Housewives who volunteered hours to peel, boil, stir, and serve. The line outside would start forming long before the doors opened. People waited in cold, in rain, in silence. And when they stepped inside, they got a bowl of hot food, sometimes accompanied by a heel of bread or a scoop of beans. And though the food was basic, boiled cabbage, weak stew, rice porridge, it was often the only real meal they'd have all week. It was something to put in an empty belly. Something to break the monotony of hunger. Community kitchens became lifelines, especially in large cities. Chicago, New York, Detroit, Los Angeles, they each had thousands of men, women, and children in line every day. At one point in 1933, there were more than 2,000 soup kitchens in Chicago alone. Some days, people were turned away when the food ran out. Other days, servers quietly thinned the soup with water just to stretch it to the last person in line. The people who ran these kitchens were often exhausted and heartbroken. They saw the same faces each day. They watched children grow thinner. They knew the names of babies who wouldn't make it through the winter. And still, they cooked. Day after day. But food aid couldn't depend on charity alone. As the crisis deepened, and unemployment passed 25%, even the most generous communities were stretched beyond their limits. That's when the federal government stepped in, awkwardly at first, and then with growing urgency. At first, federal aid came through local work programs, organized by towns and counties. In exchange for raking leaves, digging ditches, or sweeping streets, men could earn relief food, small rations of flour, lard, beans, powdered milk, and canned meat. Sometimes they received payment in scrip, local currency valid only at approved food banks or grocers. By 1933, the newly elected Franklin D. Roosevelt brought sweeping reforms. Through his New Deal, agencies like the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA, and later the Works Progress Administration, WPA, began distributing more consistent food aid. FERA funded the expansion of public food assistance. Local governments received federal dollars to keep soup kitchens running, to stock food pantries, and to provide direct rations to families in need. The program didn't eliminate hunger, but it slowed its spread. And for many, it was their first glimpse of a government that saw them, not as failures, but as people worth saving. The WPA, in addition to providing jobs, often paid workers in part with food. Many of the meals served at WPA job sites were the first warm meals workers had had in days. In some states, these meals included hot stew, boiled potatoes, bread, and canned fruit. A simple diet, but one eaten with relief. Another initiative came through the Surplus Commodities Program, launched to support farmers. When American farms produced too much wheat, pork, or dairy, and prices crashed, the government began buying up the excess and redistributing it to the hungry. This meant more butter, flour, and canned meats began appearing in food lines. It helped both the hungry and the struggling farm economy. People would line up outside churches, schools, and town halls to receive boxes labeled U.S. government property, not for sale. Inside were bags of beans, blocks of cheese, powdered milk, and the infamous canned beef, a product that some called tinned mystery for its bland, chewy texture. But no one questioned it. It was food. And it was free. At the same time, school lunch programs were introduced or expanded. In towns where children were fainting in classrooms, local teachers pushed for government-supplied lunches, often no more than bread and milk, or a bowl of hot soup. But it made a difference. For some students, school lunch was their only meal of the day. Still, receiving government aid wasn't always easy. There was a stigma, even amid mass suffering. Some refused food lines out of pride. Others lined up only in the dark of early morning, hoping not to be seen. Children remembered how their parents would whisper about it, how they were lucky but also ashamed. And yet, the impact was profound. In 1935, alone, the federal government provided nearly 30 million free meals across the country. And in that same year, more than half of all public schools were serving some kind of meal to their students. Slowly, the tide began to shift. Eventually, the system matured. Federal aid became part of the American identity, and understanding that, in times of hardship, the state had a role in feeding its people. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't always fast. But it was something, and something meant survival. Meanwhile, the community kitchens carried on, long after the worst of the Depression. Many became permanent institutions. Today's food pantries and meal programs trace their origins to those Depression-era soup lines. Churches that once handed out hot beans now run full food banks. Schools that served warm milk now operate breakfast programs. Perhaps the most enduring legacy was not the food itself, but what it represented, that no one should be left to starve in silence. That a hot bowl of soup, offered without judgment, could be a first step towards something more: healing, safety, dignity. In this way, community kitchens were never just about soup. They were about the belief that we take care of each other. That even in the darkest winters, when jobs were gone and homes lost, there would still be a place where the stove was lit, the pot was simmering, and a stranger would hand you a bowl and say, "Eat." The Great Depression is usually remembered as a time of widespread hunger, breadlines, soup kitchens, and meals made from onion water and stale bread. But there was another world, not far from those cold soup lines, where food didn't disappear, it simply became more guarded. This was the world of the wealthy. And yes, even during the worst years of the 1930s, there were still people eating lobster bisque, roast duck, caviar on toast, and chocolate mousse served in crystal dishes. Their lives did not vanish with the stock market crash. In fact, in many ways, the rich became more visible, precisely because their luxury now stood in sharp contrast to everything crumbling around them. When most of the country was counting potatoes and stretching bean soup for a family of 6, there were still lavish dinners happening behind polished doors and drawn curtains. Let's begin with the upper elite, the old money families, wealthy industrialists, financiers who weathered the economic storm thanks to inherited wealth, foreign investments, or simply good timing. These people still employed household staff. They still hosted multi-course meals. And they still dined in rooms where the silverware outnumbered the guests. Dinner in these households remained a performance, not just about nourishment but about class, refinement, and image. A typical menu might include hors d'oeuvres, like shrimp cocktail or deviled eggs, followed by consomme, a main course of braised meat, a seasonal vegetable medley, fresh bread, salad, cheese, and then a dessert of cake or pudding, paired with coffee, perhaps even a liqueur. Imported items, exotic fruits, fine wines, European chocolates, were still available to those who could pay. And even during the Depression, luxury markets didn't entirely collapse. Instead, they shrunk, serving fewer clients but maintaining high prices. Specialty grocers, high-end butchers, and private chefs kept working, though they, too, felt a growing discomfort. Then there was the emerging class of the newly rich, those who managed to grow their fortunes in the Depression, through government contracts, entertainment, or controlling essential industries. These people often flaunted their wealth, hosting lavish parties, frequenting hotels, and eating in public. Their food was part of the performance: shrimp platters, steaks, martinis. They didn't hide it, they broadcasted it. In major cities, fine dining restaurants still operated. New York's 21 Club, Chicago's Pump Room, and San Francisco's Top of the Mark served oysters, Dover sole, beef Wellington, and souffles. Reservations were required. Tuxedos were expected. And prices were high, sometimes deliberately so. The experience wasn't just about the food. It was about being seen eating well, during a time when so many others were not. Hotels, too, became safe havens for the wealthy. In their dining rooms, the Depression barely existed. They offered prix-fixe menus with elaborate courses, champagne service, and music. If you had money, you could still enjoy a proper meal, just without talking about what was happening outside. And what did the rest of the country think of this? They noticed. Newspapers reported on galas, society weddings, and opulent parties with descriptions of food in exacting detail. Roast pheasant with truffles, gold-leafed cakes, champagne fountains. These articles often ran beside stories about starving families and unemployed men sleeping in parks. The contrast wasn't subtle. It was jarring, and it hurt. For those scraping by on stewed turnips and tea made from hot water and mint leaves, the image of someone eating crab-stuffed tomatoes in a silk dining room was almost surreal. It sparked anger, envy, but also shame, the quiet, internalized feeling that if you were starving, you had somehow failed. Cartoonists of the time skewered this divide. They drew images of bankers slurping oysters while farmers begged for food. Satirical magazines mocked wealthy socialites for their obliviousness. The message was clear: some people were eating too much while others had nothing. But interestingly, some of the wealthy tried to appear modest. They hosted charity dinners. They made public donations to soup kitchens. Some even changed their menus slightly. A hostess might serve stew instead of steak to show solidarity. But often, these gestures felt hollow. They were performances of humility, not the real thing. Others simply retreated from view. They closed the curtains. They stopped throwing large parties. They told their chefs to prepare simpler meals. Not because they couldn't afford more, but because the world had changed, and they knew it. Some members of the upper class tried to help. Eleanor Roosevelt, for example, was famous for serving extremely plain meals in the White House, not because she liked them, but as a symbolic gesture of empathy with the nation's struggles. Her dinner guests were often served scrambled eggs, prune pudding, or boiled cabbage. Critics mocked her food, but she believed in setting an example. Still, for every symbolic sacrifice, there were 10 more stories of excess. Of mansions with full-time chefs. Of parties where lobsters were stacked like pyramids. Of designer cakes shaped like peacocks. For the vast majority of Americans, these stories weren't just absurd, they were deeply painful. And yet, food remains a private thing, even in public times of crisis. It was easy to hate the idea of luxury, but harder to aim that hatred at a real person. Sometimes, the wealthy quietly supported charities. Sometimes, they ignored the problem. Often, they just kept eating, because they could. This divide left a lasting scar. 4 decades after the Depression ended, the memory of who had and who didn't never quite faded. Children who grew up poor remembered what the rich ate. They remembered watching them through restaurant windows, reading about their menus in magazines, hearing about their garden parties on the radio. And some of those children, when they finally found success later in life, carried strange food habits. A refusal to waste anything. A quiet resentment of luxury. Or, paradoxically, a hunger for the very foods they'd once been denied. Lobster, steak, buttered rolls, rich desserts, not just eaten, but conquered. As if to say, I have arrived. The legacy of Depression-era food, rich or poor, wasn't just about ingredients. It was about what food meant. For the wealthy, it was a way to insulate, to remain untouched. For the poor, it was a battlefield of pride and survival. And in that contrast lies one of the quiet, painful truths of the Depression. That people weren't just divided by money, they were divided by what they could eat.